This is our seventh in the series on George Grant, Owl, and JADIS. The owl, of course, is the symbol of wisdom, the wisdom in terms of thought, and how we think our lives philosophically, theologically, and then how we live our lives practically and meaningfully in terms of our personal, our interpersonal, and our public lives. And we are always threatened by the dominance and the dynamo of the JADIS, who's the witch in the Chronicles of Narnia, who drives people both internally and externally to the point of people become victims of their own drivenness. I use JADIS in the Chronicles of Narnia, obviously because C.S. Lewis wrote it, but George Grant himself studied at Oxford University, where he did his PhD, and he and his wife Sheila were very, very involved with the Socratic Club, which Lewis helped form in 1941. And when he left for Cambridge, he left it behind. But the Socratic Club was a center in which some of the very best and the keenest and the most thoughtful and curious thinkers who were at Oxford at the time came and would debate, discuss, reflect on the Christian tradition, its relevance or its lack of it, its how do we make sense of it in the world that we live in. George Grant and Sheila, as I mentioned, belonged to the Socratic Club when they were at Oxford, and in talking to Sheila Grant after George died in 1988, she mentioned their time at Oxford and the Socratic Club was one of the most pivotal and essential in terms of George's own thinking about how to make sense of his faith as he was grappling with despair and doubt and many other very difficult issues, as any thoughtful person does in the modern world. When Grant left Oxford, he ended up coming back to Canada. His first published work, big ones, Philosophy in the Mass Age. And you could really see in Philosophy in the Mass Age C.S. Lewis's abolition of man at work. Grant is thinking through, as I'd mentioned in an earlier presentation, the liberal tradition which emerged with Puritanism in the 16th century, of which modern secular liberals are enfolded in, of the rights of the individual, all being free and equal to use their liberty as they see fit to define happiness, meaning, purpose, and the fragmentation that follows from that. Grant in the 1950s was very, very much at work through the CBC and other forms of public communication. He was teaching philosophy at Dalhousie at the time in terms of reflecting, so where does liberalism actually lead when fleshed out or unfolded? So we have these principles we are enfolded in. What do they look like ethically, theologically, ecclesially when they unfold? So just as you plant a sunflower seed, you get a sunflower plant, an acorn becomes an oak tree. Ideas have consequences, as Weaver said, and so Grant was very concerned, as was Lewis, with the realm of ideas, because he knew in the realm of ideas there were consequences in terms of people's understanding of identity, of purpose, of communities, of education, of culture, and all of these things. Grant went on to be one of the most prolific writers in Canada, and in many ways his time at Oxford with C.S. Lewis and the Socratic Club shaped, informed, and directed much of his philosophical, theological, political, and educational, cultural thinking when he came back to Canada. So I don't think there can be any doubt that that George Grant is the C.S. Lewis of Canada, and sadly so, many people will spend time on Lewis, the Inklings, MacDonald, Chesterton, and these are Canadians and North Americans, but they virtually ignore George Grant. And George Grant knew how to take these classical ideas of which Lewis saw himself as an old dinosaur, maintaining, upholding ancient ways against the modern and the postmodern, and he knew how to articulate them in a way that spoke to many people and their longings, and particularly their fragmenting longings and their desires to find deeper meaning, but all the landmarks and the cairns being gone in that sense. So in Grant's writings from Philosophy in the Mass Age through The Meant for a Nation, English-Speaking Justice, his work on Nietzsche in the 1960s, Technology and Empire, Technology and Justice. These are really just outworkings to some degree of C.S. Lewis, for example, his Space Trilogy, and where technology and science and rationalism leads and how it can dehumanize what we mean to be people. So to conclude, we need much more work in Canada and the United States on Grant and the relationship between Grant as the Canadian and North American C.S. Lewis.